Chief Justice John Roberts thought he could brush off Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez with a smug comment about her not having a law degree. What followed left the entire chamber stunned and him visibly rattled. The room smelled like old leather chairs and freshly printed paper. Cameras were everywhere, tucked behind railings, hoisted on shoulders, flashing intermittently like they were waiting for someone to slip. That morning in Washington, inside the Rayburn House office building, the air didn't just feel tense. It was thick with the kind of quiet calculation only politics can brew. Reporters lined the back wall, tapping notes into their phones, whispering headlines before they were written. It wasn't just another oversight hearing. This was about the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court, and the growing criticism around alleged gifts, undisclosed luxury trips, and a suspicious lack of accountability among some of its most powerful figures. And sitting at the center of it all, in his dark, tailored suit, was Chief Justice John Roberts. He looked composed, hands folded, jaw set, the kind of stillness that makes someone look taller than they are. His presence alone quieted the room when he entered. For years, Roberts had remained above the political mudslinging, or so he tried, but this was different. Today, he wasn't presiding from the bench. Today, he was being questioned. To his left sat the committee chair, Representative Marlon Avery from Minnesota, the kind of man who wore reading glasses too low and liked to pause before every other sentence to make people feel like they should be nervous. On the opposite side, third seat down from the center, sat Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She hadn't said a word. Hair neatly tied back, glasses pushed slightly down her nose, she studied a folder in front of her. It was worn at the edges. Dozens of tabs lined the top, orange, green, yellow, each handwritten with quick notes. She didn't look up when Roberts sat down. Didn't need to. She already knew where this was going. What many in the room didn't realize yet, what Roberts certainly didn't, was that she wasn't there to grandstand. She wasn't looking for a viral clip. She was prepared to ask questions no one had dared ask a Chief Justice in front of live cameras. Before her turn, though, came others. Representative Wendell Kinley from Utah opened the floor with a mild jab. "Mr. Chief Justice, we appreciate you being here, even if the court's attendance record with Congress hasn't exactly been consistent." The room chuckled politely. Roberts gave a tight smile. He answered with carefully measured phrases. Institutional independence, respect for constitutional boundaries, ongoing internal reviews. It was the language of someone used to not being challenged. By the fourth question, the energy was drifting. Eyes glazed. Reporters adjusted their lens caps. Then the chair called the next speaker. "Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, you have the floor." No one clapped, no one moved. The quiet stretched for 2 seconds longer than expected. She stood slowly, adjusted the microphone in front of her, and began without small talk. Chief Justice Roberts, according to Article 3, Section 1 of the Constitution, judges of the Supreme Court shall hold their offices during good behavior. Can you help this committee define what good behavior means when justices receive unreported luxury gifts from donors with business before the court? A pause. Roberts blinked. Somewhere in the back, a reporter lifted his head. "I would be happy to answer," Roberts replied, "though I do question the premise of your assertion." He offered a practiced smile, then added, "And I understand you don't hold a law degree, so I'd be happy to clarify the jurisprudence involved here." That line, that little smile, that was the moment everything shifted. AOC didn't flinch, didn't even blink. She leaned forward, just slightly, and said, "That's okay. I read your opinion in Shelby County v. Holder 3 times this week. You argued that courts should presume integrity unless there's a compelling reason not to. I think we're here because we've finally found one." But what came next would take the hearing from tense to unforgettable. And no one, not even Roberts, saw it coming. The silence after AOC's response wasn't just awkward, it was deliberate. It had weight. A few people glanced at each other, unsure if she'd just overstepped or if something more had just started. Roberts shifted slightly in his chair, the polished wood creaking under the movement. He adjusted his tie, not because it needed fixing, but because that was his default move when he felt challenged. He cleared his throat and leaned into the microphone. "Congresswoman, I believe your interpretation lacks the nuance that constitutional precedent requires. There is a long-standing tradition of judicial independence that should not be confused with impropriety." His voice was steady, words chosen with care. That was his comfort zone. Legal ambiguity. Wrap a sentence in enough legalese and most people would just move on. But not her. AOC opened her folder and pulled a paper from the third yellow tab. She didn't raise her voice, but she made sure every word landed. Chief Justice, in 2009 in Caperton v. A.T. Massey Colcomb, your court, held that a judge must recuse himself when extreme campaign contributions posed a serious risk of actual bias. Your majority opinion emphasized the need to preserve public confidence in judicial integrity. So how is it that today we're discussing luxury trips, undisclosed gifts, and the same justices ruling on cases involving those very benefactors without recusal or disclosure? A flicker. Just for a moment, Roberts' mouth tightened. He hadn't expected her to cite precedent, and certainly not his own words. "I'm aware of that decision," he replied, his tone a notch cooler. "But I would caution against drawing a direct line between campaign finance in that instance and personal hospitality offered to members of the judiciary." AOC didn't miss a beat. "So what's the threshold then? Where do we draw the line between hospitality and corruption? Is it a steak dinner? A yacht? A private jet to Montana with no disclosure forms? Or does it only become unethical once the public finds out?" That got people's attention. Even Kenley, who'd spoken earlier, tilted his chair toward her. Roberts leaned back. "You're implying malfeasance where there has been none proven, Congresswoman." She smiled, but it wasn't out of smugness. It was the smile of someone who knew she wasn't done. "I'm not implying," she said. "I'm asking. And with respect, it is this body's job to ask. We were elected to protect public trust, and when one branch of government appears to live by a different set of standards, that trust erodes." Her voice was calm but firm, measured, the kind of tone you use when you want the other person to know you're not bluffing. "And you brought receipts." Roberts shifted again. The smirk from earlier had vanished. This wasn't just about a single justice taking gifts, it was about a system, an expectation of immunity from consequences. He knew it. She knew it. "Let me ask you something else," she continued. "Why did the Supreme Court refuse to adopt the same code of conduct that every other federal judge follows? Why is the highest court the only one without enforceable ethical rules?" He didn't answer immediately. His eyes flicked toward the committee chair, then back to her. His voice dropped just slightly in volume. "There are ongoing internal discussions regarding formal codes, but I would remind you that the Constitution created the judiciary as a co-equal branch, not subordinate to Congress." She held her gaze. "And co-equal doesn't mean unaccountable. You're not above the law. You interpret it, but you don't escape it." The room didn't move. Not a pin click, not a cough. One of the aides in the corner typed furiously. Another whispered into the ear of a staffer from the Senate side. On Twitter, short clips were already spreading. The smirk, the Caperton quote, the jet to Montana, and she wasn't done. AOC closed her folder gently, not slamming it for effect, just enough to show she was finished with that line of questioning. "I have more questions, but I'll yield for now," she said, her eyes still on Roberts. "I assume you'll be ready for them when I return?" But Roberts was already starting to realize this wasn't just political theater. This was a live reckoning, and the spotlight was shifting. He wasn't used to this. Not like this. Chief Justice John Roberts had weathered his share of storms. Nomination hearings, contentious decisions, media backlash. But he'd never been on the receiving end of this particular brand of pressure, sharp, strategic, and coming from someone everyone thought would crumble under the weight of her own ambition. She wasn't crumbling, she was climbing. As another representative took the floor asking a bland question about court procedure, Roberts sat perfectly still, but his right thumb tapped against the inside of his palm. Slow, rhythmic, controlled. A tell. Anyone who knew him well would have spotted it. But the person who noticed first was Alexandria. She sat there, quietly, didn't look at him, didn't gloat. She simply highlighted a few notes in the margin of her folder, using a yellow pen with a chewed cap. The kind of pen you'd only keep if you actually studied with it. One row behind her, a junior staffer from California leaned to a colleague. "He didn't see that coming," she whispered. The colleague, not breaking eye contact with the hearing, muttered, "No one did." Because here's what was really happening. Roberts had underestimated her, not because she was young, not because she wasn't a lawyer, but because he assumed she wouldn't know how to use her knowledge, that she'd ask broad, vague questions, not drop case citations and constitutional clauses like stepping stones across a river he thought only he knew how to cross. That assumption had cost him. And then she came back. "Point of inquiry," AOC said calmly, her voice cutting through the hum of murmurs. "I'd like to resume my questioning." She didn't wait for fanfare, didn't need a dramatic cue, she just moved. "Chief Justice, I'd like to ask you about judicial recusals, specifically your dissent in Republican Party of Minnesota v. White, where you cautioned against judicial speech that could impair public trust. In that case, you warned against judges aligning too closely with interest groups. Do you still hold that view?" Roberts blinked. For a fraction of a second, he looked like someone scrambling through a mental file cabinet, trying to remember exactly what he'd said, how he'd said it, and if there was a way to walk it back without stepping into a rhetorical landmine. "Yes," he answered slowly. "I do believe the impartiality of the judiciary is paramount." "Then help me understand," she continued, voice still steady. "How impartial can a justice be if he accepts private flights, expensive lodging, and entertainment from individuals with cases before the court, and fails to disclose any of it?" No stutter, no flair, just the facts. She reached for another document and held it up. "This is a list of hospitality expenses reported by lower court judges as required under the Ethics in Government Act. Why aren't Supreme Court justices subject to the same transparency?" Roberts leaned in. "We've long maintained that the unique position of the Supreme Court, being the court of last resort, requires a different standard of review. Applying lower court rules may not account for the institutional pressures specific to our role." "But isn't the principle of accountability universal?" she pressed. "Or are we arguing that the higher the position, the less scrutiny is deserved?" That got an audible reaction, a few gasps. Someone even said quietly, "Damn." She looked around the room, not to gloat, but to anchor the moment. Then back to Roberts. "With all due respect, Chief Justice, you can't have it both ways. You can't invoke independence as a shield while rejecting oversight as a threat. One protects democracy, the other erodes it." That hit harder than she knew, because in that moment, Roberts remembered something. Decades ago, early in his legal career, he'd written a private memo during his time in the Reagan administration, cautioning against unchecked judicial activism. He had once believed in restraint. He had once argued in writing for public trust over personal legacy. Now, that memo was buried in some archive collecting dust while his legacy sat across from him, reading his own words back to him like a mirror. He sat back suddenly quiet. She didn't press further. She just let the silence do its work. And it did. But she wasn't finished, because next, she would go after the real cracks in the system that let this behavior exist in the first place. The hearing was still in session, but outside the chamber, the real show had already begun. News alerts lit up across phone screens like wildfire. AOC presses Roberts on ethics. Chief Justice struggles to defend undisclosed gifts. A 19-second clip of AOC quoting Caperton v. A.T. Massey had already passed 100,000 views, and that was just on one platform. Inside, reporters whispered updates to their editors. One staffer from an online legal outlet mouthed, "She's trending," to a colleague across the aisle. It wasn't just that she was holding her own. It was how easily she had turned the Chief Justice's carefully controlled presence into a defensive scramble. But what came next pulled the entire room tighter. AOC didn't raise her voice. She didn't pace or dramatize. She simply reached into her folder again, pulled out a single printed page and slid it forward across the table like a poker player laying down her hand. "Chief Justice, I'd like to quote a section from your concurring opinion in Free Enterprise Fund v. your Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, where you stated, 'Without meaningful oversight, power becomes self-perpetuating and opaque.' That was your wording. Do you believe it still applies?" Roberts looked at the document, then at her. "I do," he answered cautiously. "Then why is it that this court, the final arbiter of law, has no independent body reviewing its conduct, no external reporting requirement, no mechanism for investigating conflict of interest? The average federal employee is held to stricter standards than a Supreme Court justice." He shifted again, not out of anger, out of calculation, the kind of micro-adjustment you make when trying to spot the next move on a board that no longer feels familiar. AOC gave him no time to recenter. "This," she said, tapping the paper gently, "is your own writing, yet today you defend the very opacity you once warned against. So I have to ask, was that principle only meant to apply to others?" There it was. The table shook a little from someone leaning too hard on their elbow. A pen fell to the floor. No one bent to pick it up. Roberts kept his composure, but there was a pause. Not one meant for effect, but because he needed it. He licked his bottom lip once and replied, "Congresswoman, the structure of our judiciary was built on trust. The trust that justices will recuse themselves when appropriate, disclose relevant connections, and adhere to ethical standards voluntarily." "Voluntarily," she repeated, "but voluntary ethics are not ethics, they're suggestions." It sounded simple, but it wasn't. That one sentence gutted an entire argument he'd relied on for years. For a moment, he looked down, just once. And that was enough for the audience, not just in the room, but across the country, to see that something had changed. The man who had once delivered majority opinions with surgical precision now looked like he was trying to navigate a trap of his own making. AOC flipped to a green tab section of her folder. "Here's a list of decisions in which Justice C." She paused deliberately, avoiding saying the name. "Was later found to have received gifts or travel from parties connected to the case. None of these relationships were disclosed. Not once." She didn't look angry. She looked steady. "So again, I ask, how can the American public trust this court when those tasked with interpreting the law can bend disclosure rules in silence?" Robert straightened his papers, perhaps out of habit. "It's an ongoing conversation," he replied. "One I believe will result in thoughtful reform, but only after exposure, after pressure, after public embarrassment. If transparency is reactive, it's already too late." There was nothing left for him to say that wouldn't sound like damage control. The chair cleared his throat. "Let's keep this constructive, please." AOC turned toward him for the first time. "I am being constructive. We're building the foundation for actual accountability, not just symbolic oversight." Her eyes returned to Roberts. "We cannot hold the public to laws that the interpreters themselves sidestep. The law must bend toward fairness, not tradition." But what made this moment truly historic was what happened after the hearing, when those words began to echo far beyond that room. By the time the hearing paused for a scheduled break, the atmosphere had fully transformed. What began as a formal, borderline scripted routine had turned into something raw, something electric. You could feel it in the way people avoided eye contact, like they didn't want to betray what they were thinking too soon. Some were stunned, others quietly impressed. A few visibly rattled. Roberts remained seated as aides circled around him like satellites. They weren't talking loudly, just close. One whispered something and handed him a fresh folder. He took it without glancing up. He wasn't reading anymore. He was recalibrating. Meanwhile, AOC stood by the water cooler, arms crossed, expression calm. She sipped slowly from a paper cup while glancing at a text message. One of her staffers leaned in and said something about live polling responses on social media. She nodded once and looked back toward the committee table. She knew what was happening, but she didn't need to brag. She already knew this wasn't about going viral. It was about changing the stakes. When the hearing resumed 10 minutes later, Roberts tried to reset the dynamic. He answered the next two questions with more confidence, laying out distinctions between judicial conduct codes and the Constitution's appointment clause. It was textbook, well-rehearsed and thorough. But the spell had broken. Everyone knew it. No matter how polished his answers sounded, the audience, both in the room and watching from home, had already seen the crack. AOC was called back for a final round of questioning. The chair tried to keep things moving, but the room leaned in as if it knew something was about to land. She picked up where she left off. Chief Justice, I want to return briefly to the idea of voluntary ethics. He nodded slightly, but she continued before he could interject. I've spoken to public school teachers in California who are required to file detailed disclosure forms, from gifted pens to coffee cards, that are all tracked, all logged. They aren't interpreting constitutional law, they're managing classrooms. Yet their ethics rules are stricter than yours. She let that hang for a second. And no disrespect to teachers. I come from that world. But shouldn't the highest court be held to at least the same standard? This time, Roberts didn't speak right away. His eyes searched hers, and she could tell he wasn't just trying to prepare a rebuttal. He was trying to understand how he ended up on the defensive. She didn't let him gather steam. I'm going to list 5 recent cases, she said. For each one, I'll ask whether any justice involved had financial, social, or organizational ties to parties in the litigation, and whether those ties were publicly disclosed. If the answer is yes, we move to why there was no recusal. If the answer is no, we'll request full written responses from the court. The chair leaned forward. Congresswoman, please keep questions concise for the record. They are, she replied, eyes still on Roberts. This is the record. Roberts exhaled quietly, and then, one by one, she named them. Western Pipeline v. EPA, Ameritrust Capital v. CFPB, Kingsford Energy Group v. U.S. Wilton Properties v. HUD, Warwick Institute v. Department of Education. Each case had one common thread. At least one justice failed to disclose relationships or benefits tied to parties involved. AOC didn't editorialize. She read each entry like a list. Matter of fact, bulletproof. After the third case, Roberts interrupted gently. Congresswoman, some of those connections are several degrees removed. She cut in. And that's the problem. When disclosure depends on someone's personal judgment of relevance, you no longer have ethics. You have selective transparency. She paused, then added, the American public doesn't want loopholes. They want clarity. By now, even representatives who had entered the hearing neutral were sitting straighter, watching closer. Some of them weren't fans of AOC, but what she was doing, fact by fact, calmly and unapologetically, was something they couldn't argue with, because it wasn't personal. It was precise. But AOC wasn't just taking on Roberts. Her next target was the culture of silence that allowed this pattern to survive for decades without accountability. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The room was suspended in an odd stillness, not from politeness, but from tension, the kind that fills the space between people when power meets resistance and neither side is ready to back down. Roberts leaned in, eyes narrowed, fingers laced tightly in front of him. "Congresswoman," he said, his tone low, measured, "you're asking this court to submit itself to legislative interpretation of its internal functions. That risks violating the principle of judicial independence enshrined in our constitutional framework." AOC matched his tone. Judicial independence doesn't mean judicial immunity. Her words dropped with weight, not volume. She continued, "We're not asking justices to report to Congress. We're asking them to report to the people they serve. That's not overreach, that's oversight." The two locked eyes. It wasn't combative, it was controlled. But behind that control, there was a quiet intensity. She wasn't afraid of him, and he knew it. Roberts cleared his throat. "And yet, you assume the worst intentions. Gifts, hospitality. They're not inherently corrupt. Context matters." AOC leaned slightly forward. "So let's talk about context." She flipped through her folder again, this time to a blue tab. "Here's the context, Chief Justice. In Warwick Institute versus Department of Education, Justice, again unnamed here, was flown on a private jet to a speaking engagement hosted by a stakeholder in the case. That trip wasn't reported. It wasn't disclosed. It only came to light through investigative journalism. And yet, that same justice participated in the ruling. That's not context. That's conflict." Roberts looked like he wanted to say something, perhaps to clarify, perhaps to distance himself. But she pressed on before he could. "No one here is arguing that judges can't have lives, that they can't be invited to speak or attend events. But when those events are hosted by people with business before the court, and when those trips are hidden, you lose something that's hard to get back." She paused, then spoke more softly. "You lose public faith." That line, as delivered not as a blow, but almost as an appeal, seemed to shift something. Even Roberts, who had kept his expression guarded throughout, let out a breath that sounded less like control and more like resignation. But old habits die hard. "I assure you, Congresswoman, the court takes its integrity seriously, sir," he replied. "Then prove it," she said quickly. "Support mandatory disclosure rules, not just suggestions, not memos, binding standards, rules that apply equally, but no matter how high the bench." Silence again. Then Roberts did something unexpected. He asked a question. "What do you propose? A congressional ethics board overseeing the judiciary? A regulatory body embedded into the court itself?" AOC didn't hesitate. "I propose a joint commission, independent, bipartisan, with subpoena power, just like those that review executive agencies and cabinet departments. If Congress and the White House are subject to that kind of transparency, why shouldn't the court be?" The room stirred. It was a bold idea, one that had floated in legal think tanks for years but never spoken with this much force, and never to the face of the Chief Justice of the United States. He looked at her, quiet again. He wasn't trying to outtalk her anymore. He was assessing, calculating the cost of the conversation, not just politically, but historically. Because at that point, it was clear this wasn't a PR issue, this wasn't a soundbite war, it was a generational clash, a direct challenge to the belief that prestige can replace transparency, that robes make someone untouchable. And Roberts realized too late that the ground had already shifted. The young congresswoman sitting across from him wasn't throwing punches. She was asking questions, the kind that couldn't be swatted away with constitutional jargon or rhetorical sidesteps. She was asking on behalf of people who had grown tired of double standards, and every time she spoke, more of those people were tuning in. But what no one in that chamber fully expected was what AOC would do next. When she stopped asking questions and started making proposals no one had dared voice publicly. When AOC picked up the microphone again, her voice was slower, deliberate, not because she was nervous, but because she wanted every word to land. This isn't just about gifts or forms, it's about a culture that was never built for transparency. Her tone wasn't accusatory now, it was reflective, like someone who'd spent hours, maybe days, thinking about what this moment meant far beyond the room. Chief Justice, she continued, you were appointed nearly 20 years ago. You've seen 3 presidencies, multiple shifts in congressional power, and more than one constitutional crisis. And in all that time, this court has remained almost entirely insulated, not just from politics, but from public accountability. That insulation might have once been seen as protection. Today, it looks like privilege. Roberts didn't interrupt. He listened, jaw set, eyes heavy. He knew this part wasn't really directed at him anymore. It was broader, aimed at something larger than the man himself, a system, a legacy. AOC pressed on. I come from a different world. I didn't clerk for a federal judge. I wasn't born into a network of think tanks and law schools that paved the road to power. I waited tables. I borrowed textbooks. I entered public service because I didn't see anyone asking the questions regular people were asking at home. Her words rang out like a challenge, not just to Roberts, but to everyone in the chamber who thought politics should come with pedigree. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. Roberts, Yale Law, former clerk to Chief Justice Rehnquist, decades in the legal establishment, a man who believed decorum was the backbone of authority. AOC, Bronx-born, Boston University, no law degree, no judicial ties, but fully armed with research, precision, and clarity, and not the kind you can rehearse. 2 worlds, sitting 20 feet apart, but speaking across a chasm much wider, and the room felt it. One Republican lawmaker who hadn't spoken all morning leaned back and whispered to his aide, "She's not wrong." Another, previously skeptical, began reviewing notes he had dismissed as political grandstanding an hour ago. Even Roberts, though seasoned in his ability to mask reactions, showed it in his posture, shoulders lower now, less edge in his voice when he finally responded. "I don't disagree, Congresswoman, that the court's distance from certain norms has created questions, but independence exists for a reason. If the judiciary bends too far toward popular sentiment, it risks losing the very neutrality it's sworn to uphold." AOC didn't argue. "I agree with that," she said. "But there's a difference between independence and invisibility, between neutrality and negligence." She paused. "Accountability doesn't have to be partisan. It just has to be real." There it was, the line that no one in the room could shrug off. Not the senators, not the legal commentators, not even Roberts. Because in that moment, she wasn't just talking about the court. She was talking about every institution that had treated public trust like a renewable resource, drawing from it without refilling it. And she wasn't alone in feeling that way. All across the country, people were watching this exchange and nodding, not because they agreed with every policy she stood for, but because they saw someone willing to stand in a room full of power and speak like they weren't afraid to lose something. That's rare, and it's contagious. Roberts glanced down almost imperceptibly at his notes, but he didn't flip a page. He just stared at the line where his next response was supposed to begin. For the first time in the hearing, he looked tired, not angry, not defeated, just worn, because part of him knew this wasn't going away. The questions, the proposals, the growing demand for reform, it wouldn't stop when the cameras turned off. It had already left the room, but the next part would go beyond questions and theory, because AOC was about to lay out an actual roadmap for reform that no one, not even Roberts, could ignore without consequence. If the earlier moments had shifted the mood, this part changed the tempo entirely. AOC didn't raise her voice, didn't adjust her posture, but the room felt more alert, like it collectively realized she wasn't just calling out a broken structure. She was building a case. "This is a proposed model," she began, sliding a printed document across the desk toward the committee chair. She spoke with the certainty of someone who had done her homework, not for the sake of performance, but because she knew no one else would. "I've drafted a framework for a Supreme Court Ethics and Accountability Commission, composed of retired federal judges, constitutional scholars from across the ideological spectrum, and representatives from both chambers. It would be independent, it would have investigative power, and it would report directly to Congress." Roberts raised an eyebrow. She could see it, the quiet alarm behind his careful expression. "This isn't hypothetical anymore," she said. "We're beyond that." She didn't look at him when she said it. She looked out across the panel, some leaning forward, some pretending to be distracted by papers they weren't reading, but no one was ignoring her. "Under this proposal," she continued, "all justices would be required to disclose all financial ties exceeding $250, including hospitality, travel, and event-related benefits. Failure to do so would be referred to the Commission for further review. Repeat violations could trigger formal censure from Congress." One representative from Arizona asked, "And what would that accomplish if the court is still protected by lifetime appointments?" AOC turned to face him. "It restores pressure, public pressure, institutional pressure. No justice wants to be remembered as the one whose name became synonymous with unchecked privilege." That line drew murmurs. Not applause, not loud agreement, but the kind of reaction people give when they hear something uncomfortable because it might be true. Roberts finally responded. "I appreciate the thoughtful nature of your proposal, Congresswoman, but I must caution again, the judiciary is not an administrative agency. It was designed to operate independently, not under the thumb of public opinion or elected branches." "Respectfully," she replied, "no branch was designed to operate in darkness." There was no smugness in her tone, only clarity, and it was that clarity that made it hard to argue against her without sounding evasive. She flipped to another tab in her folder. This one read, "These are excerpts from judicial recusal reports between 2015 and 2022. You'll see repeated failure by at least 2 justices to remove themselves from cases where they had financial overlap with litigants or amici. These weren't minor technicalities, these were direct conflicts." She pointed to a highlighted line. "Here's one instance where a justice ruled in favor of a corporation he held stock in at the time of the decision. That case determined the scope of consumer liability in environmental damage claims. The ruling was split 5-4. His vote tipped the balance." Roberts didn't dispute the facts. He couldn't. But the blow wasn't in the data. It was in the way she delivered it, like she was laying bricks, building a wall around an argument so solid you couldn't find the exit. And people outside the chamber were watching every second of it. Legal scholars on cable panels called it surgical. Former clerks tweeted, "This isn't grandstanding. This is a master class." Law school professors from the University of Michigan to Stanford posted real-time breakdowns of her citations. Some even admitted they hadn't thought of connecting Caperton to this context, and she had, in real time, without a law degree. But that's what made it sting more. She wasn't doing this for a courtroom. She was doing it for the millions of people who never got to question anyone in power. The ones told they didn't know enough, didn't come from the right background, didn't have the right letters after their name. And with every example she laid out, she reminded those people that the law is supposed to serve them, too. "I'm not here to attack the court," she said finally. "I'm here to remind it that the trust it was built on is earned. And right now, it's eroding." Roberts leaned back slightly, his hands unclasped for the first time. He looked at her, not dismissively, not defensively, but like someone who realized she wasn't asking for permission to change the system. She was already changing it. But while the courtroom's tone had softened, the public reaction outside was boiling, and what came next would push the hearing far beyond the usual political theater into something none of them could fully control. By the time the hearing wrapped, it was already the top headline across every major news outlet. But it wasn't just the political media running with it. Late-night hosts were quoting it. Podcasters were breaking it down minute by minute. Even mainstream legal scholars were debating the implications live on air. Outside the building, the sidewalk buzzed with energy. Protesters had gathered hours earlier with vague slogans about court ethics, but now their chants had focus. Handmade signs with "No one above the law" and "Follow your own rules" felt newly relevant. College students from George Mason were live streaming interviews with people who had never attended a hearing before in their lives. Inside the chamber, staffers moved quickly to close up, but the weight of what had just happened lingered like humidity. Not loud, not chaotic, just there. Roberts exited through a side door, followed by his aides and a Capitol escort. He didn't speak to reporters. Cameras caught a close-up of his face, composed but not smug. Not this time. There was a crease between his eyebrows that hadn't been there at the start of the day. He wasn't beaten, but he had been checked. And that, for a man in his position, was rare. Meanwhile, AOC walked calmly out the front entrance, holding a worn leather binder and sipping from a plastic cup. The crowd outside recognized her immediately and erupted. Some cheered, others just pointed their phones and started filming. She didn't stop for long. She offered a quick statement to press. "I believe in a fair judiciary. That's all this was about. No one should be afraid of accountability, not even the highest court." Then she left, but the internet didn't. Within 2 hours, the full hearing had been uploaded in crisp HD with chapter markers like Minute 36, AOC challenges Roberts, and Minute 58, quote, checkmate. Edits and mashups followed, some humorous, some reverent. One video compared AOC's tone to a prosecutor's closing argument, overlaying subtle instrumental music to amplify the effect. That version hit 1 million views by nightfall. Yet, amid the viral moments, something else was happening. Pollsters reported a spike in approval ratings for AOC, particularly among moderate independents. Not for her politics necessarily, but for her poise, her focus, her ability to speak clearly without turning it into theater. Commentators who usually dismissed her as too performative struggled to criticize her this time. The facts were airtight, the delivery unshakable, and the target wasn't an opponent across the aisle. It was a system everyone had started to question, but didn't know how to challenge. Roberts, meanwhile, was quiet. He didn't release a follow-up statement, no press conference, no op-ed. Some said that was wise, let the moment pass. Others argued it made things worse. Because while AOC left with more support than she entered with, Roberts left with questions he couldn't easily answer, even among his supporters. The Wall Street Journal ran an editorial titled "The Court's Self-Inflicted Wound." In it, the writer didn't attack Roberts directly, but questioned whether the judiciary's reluctance to update its ethical standards had left it vulnerable. The tone was sharp, especially from a source that typically defended institutional conservatism. Within days, Senator Allison Redmond, a conservative Democrat from Nebraska, publicly endorsed AOC's draft commission proposal, calling it reasonable, overdue, and hard to argue against. Even more surprising, Senator Curtis Brandt, a Republican from Oklahoma and longtime supporter of judicial independence, said on radio, "I may not agree with Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez on much, but her argument about mandatory disclosures is rock solid. Transparency isn't partisan." That soundbite played across networks for a full news cycle. The push for judicial reform had officially crossed the aisle, but not everyone was on board. Some court loyalists accused AOC of grandstanding, of undermining judicial decorum. They warned this kind of pressure might politicize the bench further. A few pundits tried to frame the hearing as an overreach by an ambitious lawmaker. But that spin didn't stick. Why? Because AOC hadn't just asked hard questions. She had done what most people don't expect from politicians anymore. She listened, researched, and showed up with facts. That made her dangerous. Not to democracy, but to those who relied on opacity to stay above scrutiny. And Roberts, for all his years of restraint and reputation, had just sat in that heat, live under oath, and left the room changed. But the final act wasn't about them anymore. It was about the people watching, the ones wondering what would come next, and whether accountability was finally within reach. The next morning, headlines filled the screens at airport lounges, coffee shops, and office break rooms. AOC schools Chief Justice in real time. Supreme Showdown sparks reform movement. But the real takeaway wasn't just about the viral clips or the surprise support. It was about something more enduring, the long game of trust. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had done something rare. She didn't just perform, she delivered. She didn't grandstand, she prepared. And in a political world where too many people get by on sound bites and flash, she had done her work the way most never see, in silence behind stacks of documents late at night, before the cameras ever rolled. People saw that, and they remembered. A week after the hearing, the proposed Supreme Court Ethics and Accountability Commission was formally introduced in the House with bipartisan backing. It wasn't just a symbolic gesture, it had teeth, and it had momentum. Roberts didn't fight it publicly. Behind the scenes, legal analysts reported that he'd begun meeting with select justices to quietly discuss a code of conduct that could be adopted without appearing reactionary. It wasn't a concession, it was survival. The system adjusting just enough to avoid collapse. That's how institutional change usually happens. Not through explosions, through pressure, quiet, steady, relentless pressure. And in this case, it had come from someone who wasn't supposed to be capable of it. No Ivy League law school, no clerkships, no years on judicial committees, just grit, discipline, and a commitment to detail. The kind that didn't just win debates, but changed conversations. In an interview days later, when asked how she prepared, AOC simply said, "I read everything he ever wrote. If you want to speak truth to power, you better know their language and speak it better." That line stuck with people, not because it was clever, but because it rang true. The country wasn't looking for heroes, it was looking for clarity. And for one brief, unlikely moment, they saw it, in a room full of power from someone who wasn't supposed to have any. Roberts, to his credit, didn't lash out afterward. He didn't try to discredit her or challenge her proposals. Maybe because he understood something too, that the institution he had spent his life defending had crossed into dangerous territory. Not because of politics, but because of perception. And perception, once shifted, doesn't return to neutral on its own. That's the lesson of this moment, the moral buried underneath the sound bites and editorials. Power without accountability erodes trust, and trust, once lost, can't be restored with silence. Whether you agreed with AOC or not, whether you believed in reform or thought it went too far, the country had been reminded of something basic, something almost too obvious. Public servants serve the public, and when someone asks hard questions on behalf of those who don't get to sit in those rooms, it's not a threat, it's a duty. The story of that hearing will be retold in political science classes, podcasts, and books in the years to come, not because of the drama, but because of what it revealed, that preparation beats posturing, and that facts, when delivered with calm conviction, still matter. So if there's one takeaway, it's this: never underestimate the power of showing up ready, not flashy, not loud, just ready. And if you ever think you don't belong in a room full of people with more titles, more credentials, or more power, remember this hearing. Because Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez walked in, questioned a Supreme Court Chief Justice on live national television, and didn't blink once at all. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the importance of holding power to account, no matter who holds it, subscribe for more real stories that challenge assumptions and spark conversation. And share this with someone who still believes that truth, when spoken clearly, can change the course of history.